So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third webinar in the series organized by ChildFund Alliance, Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, and the CPC Learning Center at Columbia University. So this is the third webinar in a series of three, as I said, and my name is Faith Nimineh from ChildFund Alliance. I'm based in New York. I'm the Senior Humanitarian Advisor, and I'm serving as the moderator for this particular webinar today. So a few housekeeping. We have the question and answer at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom. If you have questions for any of the panelists or general questions, please put them in the chat and we will direct your questions to the panelists as we continue the webinar. We also are conducting the webinar in English, and we hope that you will be able to ask questions. We also will share with you a recording. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share that at the end of the webinar with participants that have registered with any presentations from any of the panelists. So without any further delay, I would like to start. And as I said, this has been a collaboration between the three entities, and this is the third and our final webinar in the series. So in our first two, we talked about the root causes of children in armed conflict, and we looked at some of the practices of detention and denationalization of children. So in this third webinar, we will be talking about steps that we can take as professionals, as researchers, as students, as public health officials to address some of these root causes and to take actions on protecting children that are involved in our conflict. So to do this today, we have with us three distinguished panelists. The first person that will be speaking to us today is Laura Perez. Laura is a lecturer at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She is also an international consultant working on children in armed conflict, human rights, and humanitarian affairs. She previously served as the Helen Hillman Fellow and Director of Graduate Studies at Fordham's University Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs, where she directed academic programs in humanitarian studies, led the Children and the Armed Conflict Research Pillow. The second person speaking to us today will be Dr. Rob Grace. Rob is a lead researcher at Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict. He also holds faculty positions at Tufts University and the University of San Diego, where he teaches courses on civilian protection in humanitarian response in armed conflict. And the third person speaking to us today will be Madame Mikiko Otani. She is a member and former chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. She is an international human rights lawyer with long-time practice experience and a civil society background. She has initiated and contributed to increasing focus on children in armed conflict in the work of the CRC. And as I said, serving as your moderator, I'm Faith Nimineh from ChildFund Alliance, and I'm based in New York. So at this time, I will turn the floor over to Laura, who will talk about some of the strategies to ensure that the children in armed conflict tools address the needs of all children that are affected by conflict, especially children with disability. Laura will be talking about her research, and you have the opportunity at the end of her presentation to ask her questions about this research and talk about children in armed conflict. So Laura, at this time, the floor is yours, please. Present.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Faith. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'll be speaking about the impact of armed conflict on children with disabilities based on research that I conducted in 2023 for the UN Office of the Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. I think it's always important to start with key statistics to give you a better sense of the global context of disability. According to the World Health Organization, WHO, at least 15% of the world's population has some form of disability. Today, this global prevalence rate of 15% corresponds to more than 1 billion people living with some form of disability globally. UNICEF estimates that nearly 240 million children, or 1 in 10 children worldwide, have disabilities. While comprehensive figures on the number of children with disabilities living in situations of armed conflict specifically are unavailable, several factors suggest that the percentage may surpass global averages. These factors include the devastating impacts of armed conflict on children, correlating factors such as poverty, lack of access to healthcare, nutrition and sanitation, high rates of sexual violence, all of which could potentially heighten the likelihood of long-term impairments for children. The impact of discrimination and stigma, which often prevents families from registering children with disabilities with government authorities or humanitarian organizations, and the challenges of data collection in countries affected by armed conflict, including lack of awareness and limited technical capacity on disability inclusion of humanitarian or other actors operating in these contexts. What we know is that children with disabilities are at a greater risk of violence, neglect, and exploitation during armed conflicts, and that armed conflicts can lead to new disabilities through injuries, malnutrition, and inadequate healthcare. I'll be focusing specifically on the UN's Children in Armed Conflict mandate and the 6th grade violations that are monitored through the monitoring and reporting mechanism to speak about how children with disabilities are at a heightened risk for the 6th grade violations. In terms of recruitment and use, children with disabilities face a higher risk of abandonment or separation from their parents or caregivers while fleeing violence, and children without parents or caregivers face an increased risk of recruitment by armed groups. Due to the high levels of stigma, discrimination, and lack of inclusive education, children with disabilities are less likely to attend school. Out-of-school children are at a higher risk of recruitment by and use by armed groups. And armed groups often exploit children with intellectual disabilities, forcing them to act as suicide bombers, for example, or as human shields, or even using them for trafficking weapons. On killing and maiming, children with mobility impairments are at a higher risk of being unable to flee active conflict zones or evade shelling and airstrikes. Incidents of killing and maiming of children with disabilities may lead to secondary impairments, including loss of vision or hearing and severe burns or mutilations. Injuries caused by explosive weapons are among the main cause of impairments for children in armed conflict. And children with disabilities may be left behind by their families or caretakers when evacuation routes are inaccessible. Also, children with physical or intellectual disabilities are at a greater risk of being left behind during evacuations. For example, they may lose access to assistive devices such as wheelchairs, hearing aids, or prosthetics, which are needed for their mobility, communication, and independence. Without these devices, their ability to move to safety or even communicate their needs can be severely limited. And early warnings about danger may not be accessible to children with disabilities. A child who is hearing impaired cannot respond to a siren they cannot hear, and a child with cognitive impairments may need simplified instructions to understand how to respond to warnings. On sexual violence, we know that children with intellectual disabilities are almost 5 times more likely to be subjected to sexual violence than other children. Children with disabilities and their families are also less likely to report sexual violence out of fear of not being believed. Children with disabilities may experience serious physical injuries and or psychological trauma as a result of sexual violence. In some cases, children with disabilities are at particular risk of something called virgin rape, which is when armed actors believe the false myth that persons with HIV, AIDS, or other sexually transmitted infections can be cured by having sexual intercourse with a virgin. Girls with disabilities are often incorrectly believed to be asexual and therefore presumed to be virgins, making them particularly at risk to this form of sexual violence. Regarding abduction, children with disabilities may face increased vulnerability to abduction because they are more likely to be unaccompanied or separated from their parents or guardians, especially in contexts of displacement. Children with disabilities may be more targeted for abduction because they may be perceived to be unable to protect themselves. On denial of humanitarian access, children with disabilities are also often excluded from humanitarian programs because their specific needs are not considered or understood. Humanitarian services are often inaccessible, either physically, for example, when facilities are not wheelchair friendly, or procedurally, for example, when programs lack communication aids for children with sensory disabilities. Discrimination can also result in children with disabilities being deprioritized during the distribution of aid. Children with disabilities suffer significantly more from the impact of the denial of humanitarian access because it can prevent them from accessing food, medication, assistive devices, medical treatment, or psychosocial support and counseling. And lastly, on attacks on schools and hospitals, children with disabilities face high levels of discrimination and stigma in the education system and are more likely to be left out of school than other children. Out of school children with disabilities are at higher risk of violence, abuse, and exploitation. And the disruption of services when educational infrastructure is attacked or destroyed, such as therapy centers and inclusive schools, can have a disproportionate impact on children with disabilities. In terms of other findings, one of the main problems has to do with information and data gathering. So data is not disaggregated by disability in humanitarian contexts more generally, and on children with disabilities in situations of armed conflict more specifically. This means that the monitoring and reporting mechanism doesn't disaggregate along the lines of disability, in other words, not generating information on the impact of armed conflict on children with disabilities. There's also a problem with terminology. One of the sixth grade violations is called killing and maiming. And maiming is an outdated term that lacks a more modern understanding of the term disability. So the term maiming really encompasses physical injuries and not psychosocial injuries. And it can be highly stigmatizing for people with disabilities. On the protection of civilians, I've mentioned early warning systems and evacuation procedures that are rarely adapted for persons with disabilities who may not be able to see, hear, read, or understand the instructions, or who may need assistive devices such as ramps or wheelchairs to be able to flee an active conflict zone. When making assessments about the presence of civilians in given areas, military commanders rarely factor in the presence of civilians with disabilities because they rely on data that is not disability inclusive, such as census data generated by governments. On consultations with organizations of persons with disabilities, despite the importance of consulting with OPDs, organizations of persons with disabilities are systematically left out of planning processes on humanitarian action, assessment, and on monitoring and reporting and evaluation. I have several recommendations, Faith, but I'm wondering if we can wait on those for the questions that you'll be asking later on.
Yes, we will. We can wait for question and answer. Thank you, Laura. So I just want to say thank you to Laura for presenting to us the situation of children in our conflict with disability. As you heard from her presentation, she talked about the global statistic, the percentage of children living with disability, and she also mentioned the sixth grade violations in terms of children in our conflict and the risks that they face. And so we'll discuss that further in the question and answer part. So at this time, what I will do now is to pass the floor over to Rob, who will talk about more on the research that Watchlist did this year. So this year, Watchlist produced two online tools that are relevant to protect children in armed conflict. The Children in Armed Conflict Global Dashboard and a digital library on CAAC. So Rob is going to talk about the relevance of these tools, the trends in grave violations against children in armed conflict, and the role of national laws and policies to be able to shape some of these trends. So Rob, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share some slides.
Yes.
I'm going to assume that they are showing unless someone starts yelling at me. So yes, thank you very much, Faith. As Faith said, I'm going to discuss these two tools that Watchlist has produced this year that I hope will be useful for stakeholders in this field for addressing the issue of identifying and pursuing practical measures for mitigating risk for children in armed conflict. Here's the first tool. The Watchlist Children in Armed Conflict Global Dashboard, or CAAC Global Dashboard is the abbreviation for Children in Armed Conflict. This is online now. It's live now, so y'all can go and explore yourself. You can go to access it at the watchlist.org website, click on resources, click on dashboard. It'll take you to this map. And essentially what Watchlist has done is taken data from UN Secretary General annual reports on children in armed conflict and put them into an online platform that can facilitate exploring that data. So the data is from the monitoring and reporting mechanism that Laura mentioned in her remarks. These reports present data on the numbers of different grave violations against children that different parties to armed conflict have committed each year, and in the annexes list parties to armed conflict that are responsible for those violations. And this platform is intended to just serve as a bridge for stakeholders in this field that are interested in exploring this data and to the data itself. So it presents it in a way that aims to be accessible and aims to let people explore trends over time and zero in on particular data points. There are a few reasons that we need to approach this data with some caution. I'll lay out some of them. One is the dashboard just includes contexts where there is at least one party listed in the annex to the report. So there are other contexts as well that are included in the reports, but that data is not yet included in the dashboard. The dashboard also just now includes data on trigger violations. So as Laura mentioned, there are 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict. One of them is denial of humanitarian access for children. That grave violation is the one violation that does not trigger listing in the report. So the dashboard does not yet include data on denial of humanitarian access. And in terms of the UN data on which this dashboard is incorporating, it's only verified violations. So there's surely many more violations that the UN has not been able to verify. It's widely acknowledged that that the data included in the reports is an undercount, and there can be various factors that can shape whether a data point can be verified. Sometimes it depends on the extent of access that the country field team has, issues of security, issues of capacity of the country field team as well. So we have to approach this data with a certain degree of caution, but as long as we're mindful of those caveats, it still can be incredibly useful. And I'll show you an example in particular where the data tells a story that reflects on the ground realities. I'm going to show you some data from the DRC. So you can select from different fields. I've selected DRC. I've selected just state entities, and we're just looking at data from the 2010 report onward. And the light blue line that you see is very high in 2010 and then drops sharply and then stays pretty low and then goes down to 0 and stays at 0. That line is recruitment and use of children of the FARDC, the Armed Forces of the DRC. And that reflects an actual shift, an actual change. The FARDC, the government armed forces of the DRC, has been listed for recruitment and use since the beginning of the listing mechanism back in 2002. In 2012, they signed an action plan with the UN on this, and in 2017 were delisted, and the data here tells that story. The orange line that you see persisting throughout, that is numbers of per year rape and other forms of sexual violence against children. You see that persisting. That's a persistent issue in the DRC. You can also see the uptick in 2018, that dark blue line. That line is killing and maiming, and that uptick reflects in particular, the violence in the Kasai region during that time period. So I show this to you as just one example. You can explore more on the webpage, but just one example of which, even caveats aside, the data does tell a story and can be useful for exploring trends over time. I also, for Watchlist, produced a report analyzing some of this data and presenting some findings. I'll give you a teaser of one of the findings from that report. I was interested to look at the top state perpetrators of trigger violations. And if we look at the top three top state perpetrators in context with listed parties, here's what we get. We get Israel in 2023, Myanmar in 2023, and Syria in 2018. And I was interested in probing the external supporters of these listed parties. And for the top three, we see that P5 UN Security Council member states, permanent 5 members of the Security Council, were responsible for sending all or a majority of the arms to these parties to armed conflict. There's more data along these lines in the report that I produced. I'm hoping we can drop the link to the report in the chat. But this is just one way that you can use this data in the dashboard and combine it with other sources of data to try to get a sense of what is driving some of the trends that we see in the dashboard. So that's tool number one, the dashboard. I'll lay out tool number two, which has not been released. So I'm giving you a bit of a preview here. You're seeing it for the first time. The Watchlist digital library on children and armed conflict that we are working to finalize right now. There are 2 components of it. One is this digital library will contain some multilateral documents, some UN documents on children and armed conflict, including Security Council resolutions, as well as links to the UN Secretary General annual reports. But the real juice of this digital library is this component. If you click on database on national laws and policies, we have spent the year working with a global team of researchers to identify and gather national legal and policy documents on children and armed conflict. And the aim of this component of the digital library, the aim of this database is to examine the extent to which the multilateral children in armed conflict has been integrated into the domestic level. What gaps do we see? What successes do we see? This database will enable examination of some of those questions. And in 2025, I'll have some reports coming out analyzing the findings. So there's much more to come in 2025, but I highlight this as a key a point for our attention in thinking about practical measures is developing legal and policy frameworks in country. Getting back to the DRC, just to show one example of what we can see in the database. Again, remember the light blue line, recruitment and use of children, drastic decrease from 2010 onward. A key component of that shift was the adoption of a series of legal and policy measures in the DRC to enable that process. Here are just a few of them. In 2009, the DRC adopted an operational framework for children associated with armed groups. This was about separating children from armed groups. The DRC Constitution, which came into force in 2007, Article 90, proscribes youth participation in armies. In 2009, the law on protection of the child criminalized recruitment and use of children. In 2016, the DRC adopted standing operating procedures on age verification to ensure that the military has a process for determining the age of people who are being enlisted into the military. So that's just a snapshot. That's just a little preview. But again, I highlight that as one important area for us to think about and unpack when we're thinking about practical measures to address all the issues that we're discussing. And again, the dashboard, it's live now, so I welcome you all to go and explore and see what you can find. And again, the digital library will be launched very soon. So we will be doing a lot of we'll be pumping that out into the social media universe. So you'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks and over the course of 2025. I'll leave it at that. Faith, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, for such interesting information. Thank you for the teaser. So as you've heard, Rob will explore a little bit more in the question and answer. If you have any question or you want to get clarity on some of the data he's presented from the documents that they reviewed. Now at this time, we will turn to our last speaker, Madam Mikiko. So as I introduced her earlier and said, she is the former chair of the CRC and she is a current member. So she will talk about the role of the CRC in protecting children in armed conflicts. And she will also reflect on her time as a CRC committee member and the actions that were taken to protect this particular group of children. Mikiko, over to you.
Thank you, Faith. And thank you for having me as part of this webinar series and giving me the opportunity to talk about the role of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, CRC, we call, for protection of children in armed conflict affected settings. For those who are not familiar with the CRC, let me start with the brief introduction of the CRC. The CRC was established by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted by UN General Assembly in 1989, 35 years ago. The CRC is composed of 18 independent individual experts elected by the 196 state parties and has 3 sessions a year to conduct work in Geneva. The mandate of the CRC is to monitor the implementation of the convention and its 2 optional protocols by the state parties for realization of children's rights. The CRC delivers the mandate through periodic country reviews, individual communications and inquiry, and the adoption of general comments. The Convention on the Rights of the Child and the 2 optional protocols, in particular the optional protocol in the involvement of children in armed conflict, OPAC, provide international legal obligation of states to protect children in armed conflict. The convention establishes protection of children under the international humanitarian law and recovery and reintegration of child victims of armed conflict as children's rights. The obligations of states to respect and ensure children's rights under the convention don't stop even in conflict settings. These include children's right to life, survival and development, education, play, health, nutrition, food, water, protection from violence, torture, detention, sexual violence, non-separation from parents, and others. All children are protected without discrimination of any kind, such as gender and disabilities. The OPAC specifically provides children's right to be protected from recruitment and use in armed conflict by also it covers the recruitment and use by non-state armed groups. The CRC makes recommendation to the states as the outcome of the country reviews. Most recently, the CRC reviewed Ukraine in 2022, Russia and Israel this year in 2024. But the question is how to ensure that the recommendations are actually implemented and how to hold the governments more accountable for violation of children's rights in conflict settings. There are many challenges, but I'd like to focus on the most critical challenge in my view. That is the complexity and perceived technicality of the issue of protection of children in armed conflict. Although this is undoubtedly a very important area of child rights, effectively addressing the issues and making impactful recommendations requires the broader understanding of international law and relevant documents such as international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and the Security Council resolutions. Just to give you an example, in our previous speakers, Roland and Rob, both mentioned that 6 grave violations. These include killing and maiming. These 6 violations are very popular and known around the CAAC agenda, Children Armed Conflict agenda. However, these 6 grave violations have developed under the Security Council resolutions. So for the committee, when the committee uses the data and statistics around these 6 grave violations, we need to use those in the convention's terminology and also relate to the specific rights under the articles under the convention. So which requires the proper understanding of how the Security Council address those issues, and also we need to understand the international humanitarian law. So it is critically important for the CRC to receive credible legal and factual information, experts' advice and support from relevant mandates, mechanisms, and stakeholders. And in this regard, we are very grateful for the studies such as the studies and research on children with disabilities led by Roland, and also all the information provided and available by Watchlist, for example. So those different legal standards, approaches, and terminologies also create obstacles to interaction and collaboration among mandates, academia, and civil society for armed conflict, international humanitarian law, security, humanitarian actors on one hand, and the broader child rights community on the other hand. This is the other aspect of the most critical challenge arising from the complexity of protection of children in armed conflict. Complexity is not only about the different legal frameworks, but also about the various mandates, mechanisms, and bodies. These are the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Security Council, its monitoring and reporting mechanism, Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict, UNICEF, ICRC, International Criminal Court, commissions of inquiries, investigative and fact-finding mechanisms, and the UN human rights mechanisms such as special procedures and universal periodic review of the Human Rights Council in addition to the CRC. The recommendations of the CRC have both strengths and limitations. The recommendations can be comprehensive, covering the broad scope of child rights affected in the conflict settings. The CRC's country review can be a long-term monitoring tool for recovery and reintegration of conflict-affected children and access to justice and effective remedies to child victims. The CRC can emphasize child rights approach in the recommendations, such as non-discrimination, focusing on intersectionality, child participation, and the best interests of the child. But the CRC recommendations can contribute to hold the government accountable when referred and reinforced by other mandates and mechanisms. While the CRC recommendations are addressed only to the states, the SRG CAAC can engage with the parties to conflict, including non-state armed groups, for development and implementation of action plan for their commitments and actions. So this is one of the examples how the different mandates can support or complement each other. This is my strong belief that all relevant mandates, mechanisms, and bodies should work in a way to reinforce the work of each other based on the understanding of who does what and their strengths and limitations. In this regard, it is very encouraging to see the recent developments of cooperation and collaboration among various actors and increasing efforts to bring all actors closely for discussions on policies and actions. The joint activities such as events and statements by the SRC CAAC and CRC committee, which led to the recent signing of the letter of agreement between the two mandates, is just one example. More interactions among actors in New York and Geneva is another example. Recommendations of Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council addresses protection of children in armed conflict more frequently. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is currently preparing the report on the rights of the child and violations of the human rights of children in armed conflicts upon the request of the Human Rights Council to be presented to the 60th session in June 2025. This increasing focus on children and armed conflict as child rights issues in the UN Human Rights Mechanism in Geneva is important for more implementation of the CRC recommendations and more accountability of governments. Challenges are enormous. While we are talking, children continue to be killed, injured, sexually abused, displaced, lose their parents, families, learning. I often hear children tell us, no more talk, please, and act now. Turning commitments into action, this call is also upon us. I very much look forward to hearing from other panelists and participants on what the CRC committee can do more. Thank you very much, Faith.
Thank you, Mikiko, and for giving us a framework analysis on the legal framework and what is available to protect children, what accountability we have to do that, and what the CRC has been doing to be able to protect these particular children. So what we will move into a period of the next interaction. So what you heard in the first part of this webinar, we heard from Laura, who talked about CAAC, children armed conflict, in particular children with disability, what they face. She talked about the sixth grade violations and all of the things that we know can happen to these particular group of children, especially children with disability during situations of armed conflict. Rob gave us the database that is available with data that we have and what we can use based on analysis that they've done of all of the different frameworks that are in place. And Mikiko talked about the legal frameworks for accountability and what the CRC Committee on the Rights of the Child is doing to protect children in situations of armed conflict. So right now, what we will do, I'll pass it to Laura. And then we will look at the real action, because this third webinar, as we said, we wanted to talk a little bit in terms of what actions we've taken, how we've turned all of these commitments into action in terms of advocacy, programming, and policy to be able to protect children in situations of armed conflict. So I know you have some recommendations from your research. So I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Faith. I appreciate it. In terms of recommendations, the first recommendation is on strengthening data collection on children with disabilities. This has an impact across the MRM, but also across justice mechanisms and accountability mechanisms. As we've heard from Mikiko today, having that data is very important. So currently the MRM data is disaggregated by violation, by age, and by sex, but it is not disaggregated by disability. To address the lack of disability disaggregated data, the recommendation is to incorporate the Washington Group Questions for Children, known as the Child Functioning Module, into the set of questions that are used by field-based monitors as part of the MRM data collection methodology, but also other human rights data collection methodologies. The Child Functioning Module is a data collection tool that has proven effective in collecting quality and comparable data on children with disabilities. Now, incorporating the Washington Group Questions for Children would include developing training modules that are designed specifically for MRM staff or for other human rights monitors on disability inclusion data collection methods to improve the accuracy and reliability of the reports that are generated by the MRM or by other justice mechanisms. The second recommendation is on terminology. I mentioned the problem with the term maiming for the violation killing and maiming. Because the current definition of maiming focuses on physical injuries acquired as a result of armed conflict, MRM monitors do not gather information on non-physical disabilities, such as psychosocial disabilities. Psychosocial disabilities may include the long-term effects of trauma from experiencing or witnessing atrocities, such as armed attacks, explosive blasts, or rape or other forms of sexual violence. The recommendation is to allow for a more expansive and more modern understanding of the term maiming, which would in turn allow the MRM to collect information on non-physical disabilities, such as psychosocial disabilities. On consultation with persons with disabilities, there are two recommendations on this front. One is to consult with local organizations of persons with disabilities as possible sources of information for the UN monitoring and reporting mechanism, which is not something that is being done today. And the second recommendation is to engage with OPDs on the design and implementation of child protection programs to ensure that they are inclusive and representative of the needs of children with disabilities in armed conflict contexts. And the last recommendation is on training and capacity building. This cuts across several target audiences for training. So it would be about incorporating child rights and disability training into peacekeeping, humanitarian, and monitoring missions to ensure that personnel understand the specific vulnerabilities of children with disabilities. For example, providing military commanders with training on disability inclusion to raise their awareness on the demographic composition of the civilian population. They often assume that civilian populations are homogeneous. So this kind of training would be important for proportionality assessments, as it would strengthen their understanding of the impact of an attack on children with disabilities in comparison to other civilians. And it would also impact the way military commanders issue early warnings or implement evacuation procedures so that both are accessible to children with disabilities. Thank you, Faith.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for these recommendations. As we said in the opening, we will have Laura's report available, and you will be able to see the specific recommendation on data on children with disability for the MRM, on the terminology, and on training and capacity building for all actors. And now, Rob, there is a question in the chat for you. Do you want to talk about that? They're asking how do you plan to include indicators of governance more broadly into the database to reflect laws?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that question, Gary. I saw it down there. It's such an important question. Gathering a database of documents of national laws and policies is, we hope, a very useful step. But adopting a law or adopting or agreeing upon a policy document is one step in the process. The actual question is, okay, what happens afterwards? And in many cases, there's a law that is adopted that's strictly just a law on the books. There's absolutely no implementation. So a corpus of documents alone does not tell you the whole story. It just tells you one part of the story. But to answer your question, Gary, to what extent will the database incorporate those considerations? It will, but more is needed. So for each document that is in the database, you'll be able to go to a page that will have some information giving just a summary of the document and have some very broad comments about the state of implementation. But really, we see at Watchlist, we see that as the next step in the research that we hope will build on this being one step, and the next step being a deeper probe into implementation and compliance and accountability and some of those dynamics as well. But thank you for flagging that. I'll also say, if I can, Gary, I saw you also asked about non-state armed groups. Great question as well. A lot of what will be included in this digital library will be state documents. Some non-state armed groups documents will be included as well. Geneva Call has done some work on this. They have a database called In Their Words, where they have collected a lot of non-state armed group statements and commitments and declarations on IHL more broadly, many of which do address issues of children, and they're not just Geneva Call deeds of commitments. There are other documents as well. So we don't want to duplicate what they have done, but we will include some documents and data on non-state armed groups to complement that one. So thanks for your question. Faith, back to you.
Thank you, Rob. And I think you will have the chance to give your last word in terms of some of the policy gaps maybe that we could talk about before we close. But I just want to pass the floor to Mikiko and to our participants. Please, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A. If we cannot answer these questions now, you will receive some materials at the end of this webinar with maybe some of the information that we have for you in there. Mikiko, I know you talked a lot about the legal framework, and you mentioned the issue of accountability for grave violations against children. You also said that as we are hosting this webinar, there are many children in many situations of armed conflict around the world that are dying right now as we speak. So I just want to hear your reflections in terms of what can governments do to be able to protect these children and prevent the sixth grade violations from happening. Do you have any reflection for us on that?
Thank you very much. So in terms of the role of the governments, I want to highlight the fact that the protection of children in armed conflict is not just the obligation of the states in the conflict or in the post-conflict. So the Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child recognize the obligation of the states to provide necessary assistance to those states who are in need. In that sense, that I have to say that it is the obligation of all states to provide assistance and to the protection and also the recovery and the integration of the child victims. And also for those who are not in the conflict situation still can contribute by, for example, domesticating the international law, which creates the practice of national law, which integrates all the such as the prohibition of recruitment and use of the children in the armed conflict, with even though those countries are not in the conflict, but still it can reinforce the norms at the international level, universally. And secondly, I go to the other area. I'm sorry to it's not so much about the government obligations, but I just want to pick up what Laura said, such as the terminology, like naming. So in my short intervention, I highlighted the one of the technical complexity, which is a different terminology. I mentioned the different terminologies, but also the terminology itself has some implications. And as I said, the sixth grade violations are not the term in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So sometimes we unconsciously just use the term, which is used, but the recent studies and developments of the norms allow us to update our own use of terminology. So this is one of the example how the community can benefit from the academic studies or the studies by experts, and to make ourselves more sensitive to the children's issues for all the children, including the children with disabilities. And finally, if I may, I want to make one recommendation. So from the Convention on the Rights of the Child point of view, the child participation is one of the key principles. But when it comes to this area, children and armed conflict, we rarely include the children in the discussions. So I think this is something we can do. And recently, we have many discussions in this topic, on this topic, children and conflict, but we really want to hear from the children and collect the ideas from themselves, what we can do more. And I think we should start something which can be done immediately based on their views as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikiko. And I like the last point that you ended on in terms of how do we hear from children themselves, those that are affected by armed conflict, about how we can protect them. And I think this is something that all of us here, our organizations that we work for, we could be able to explore some of that with the RSG on CAAC, ensuring that the voices of children are part of the conversation, and we take that recommendation seriously. I know we are reaching up to the hour. We have some questions in the chat around data and data protection for children that I'm not sure, Rob, you will be able to answer, but do you want to touch on that a little bit before we, maybe after you do that, and then I can just give all of you maybe 1 minute to just your final word. I think Mikiko have already said hers, you and Laura, and then we can just wrap up. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. And my apologies. I can't speak to the specifics of that question, but it points to a broader issue that I've been thinking a lot about, which is digital harms for children, and intersection between possible digital harms and grave violations against children and other ways that children can be harmed. But essentially, what I see is an opportunity for more interaction and more engagement between different communities that are focused on different aspects of civilian protection. People like us focus on children in armed conflict, and stakeholders in this field is one. There's also a set of policy actors and researchers in the field of how humanitarian organizations use data, and how humanitarian organizations can sometimes unintentionally create harm due to the way that they handle data, and military use of digital technology and AI. And I see that there are three sort of distinct communities of people probing these issues, and I'm interested in bringing them together for some further examination of these issues. So for me, that's sort of where I come in, as a bit more of a broader answer than getting into the specifics of what the question was, but I think it points to a very crucial, more overarching question.
Thank you, Rob. And your final word on this topic as we wrap up, and then I'll pass it on to Laura for her final reflection, and then we'll close.
Sure, I'm happy to give a final word. I'm a researcher, so I'm going to give a researchery-esque final word, and that's that we need more research. We will always need more research, but the Children in Armed Conflict agenda was birthed in the 90s. We have decades worth of experience to mine for lessons learned. There has been great work done, but there's always more that can be done. In the DRC graph that I showed, we see the light blue line go down. That's recruitment and use. That is a success story. We need to probe those success stories and try to understand as best as we can why and how they have happened, and what lessons we can draw forward to other contexts as well. I'll say one final thing before I turn it back over to you, Faith. The report I produced I think the link has been shared in the chat. Has some other findings from the dashboard, so I encourage you to go take a look at it. But one of them points to the importance of local civil society in child protection. So one overarching area of focus as we're thinking about practical measures forward is, the way I see it, bolstering interoperability between all the different facets of institutions and individuals engaged in child protection. We heard, especially from Mikiko, just the wide array of institutional actors engaged in this area. But important also to highlight local civil society and to explore how the international stakeholders in the CAAC domain can support local civil society, put them in the front and center, and having that be an important point of focus. I'll end on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Laura?
Thanks. I just wanted to say something about data protection. The question on data protection and software, I think it was particularly for NGOs. I didn't want to respond to the NGOs, but more on the UN side. UNICEF and the UN use a system called Primero, which is the MRM IMS, the MRM Information Management System, which has been developed over several years precisely to strengthen data protection. And it sits on the cloud. It has many aspects to it, including when monitors gather information on their cell phones, for example, that information is automatically updated to the cloud and then deleted from the cell phone to protect the information. So there are specific programs out there and platforms that are being used for that, specifically by the UN and the MRM. In terms of last words, I wanted to say that in order to better protect children with disabilities in situations of armed conflict, we need to have a better understanding of the differentiated impact on them of armed conflict. And so, unfortunately, they continue to be invisible in things like assessments of civilian populations, in humanitarian programming, in consultations on the impact of armed conflict, in the collection of data. And there are concrete steps that can be taken to really narrow that gap and answer those questions and start to change the way we understand the impact of armed conflict on children with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Mikiko. Thank you for all of the great information that you've shared. And we are on the top of the hour. And I just like to say that a few real takeaway we've had today from this conversation in our final series for the year. We know that children in armed conflict, whether those with disability or not, they face special situation, and we should pay attention to that. We need the data to be able to speak to the situation and to tell us what to do so that as programmers, as policymakers, and as practitioners, we are able to plan properly. And on the other hand, as Mikiko said, we need accountability. So as we've seen around the world today, children are in situation of armed conflict, and it's our responsibility, all of us, whether we are researchers, students, policymakers, we are advocates, or we are maybe parents in our own capacity. We have the responsibility to protect them and to ensure their care. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us at ChildFund Alliance, Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, and the CPC Learning Network at Columbia University. Mikiko, we just want to say thank you to all of you who've joined us today. And you will hear from us. We will share with you the recording of this webinar. You can explore all of the resources. We've talked about Laura research, Rob, two tools that Watchlist is developing, and we will share that with you in the final product of all of this. We look forward to the great collaboration next year. And I want to say thank you from all of us, and be well.